Hello and welcome to my second video. In this video I'll be going through the defenses available to murder, more specifically loss of control. There's also diminished responsibility, and loss of control and diminished responsibility are the only available defenses to murder. They're known as special defenses basically. I'll be going through the structure of loss of control and what essentially you have to include in it. Remember, this is a model answer and you have to fill in the application where necessary and relevant to the scenario you'll be placed with in the exam. So let's go. Murder defenses, loss of control. So continuing on from the murder answer that I've posted a video on previously. However, as a partial defense to the murder charge, defendant's name, which would apply to the scenario, may be able to raise the defense of loss of control. Loss of control is a special defense to murder and aims to reduce the liability to voluntary manslaughter. The law is set out in Section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, and there are 3 requirements to loss of control. Essentially, it tells you what loss of control is and what it does, and tells you what a defense is set out. You can also write subsections 54 to 56 as if that's mentioned in your textbook. But I've written 54 because that's what I've been told to do. Okay, then I've mentioned the 3 requirements. Then you go through the requirements. The first requirement is for the defendant to prove that the killing must have resulted from a loss of self-control. The loss need not be sudden, but control must have been lost. So the first requirement is stated, and then you go on to explain the cases relevant to this. In Ahluwalia, provocation was not available as a defense, as the defendant waited for her husband to fall asleep before killing him. In Thornton, the defendant killed her husband after a delay of an abusive incident, and it was held that last straw could trigger final loss of self-control. 2 cases here relevant to the killing must have resulted from loss of self-control to show general knowledge points, and then after this you would relate it to the scenario. So in this instance, whatever the defendant's name in your scenario is, had lost control when, you would apply it back and you'd say what happens and how the loss of control was met. Secondly, there must be a qualifying trigger. These can include fear of serious violence from the victim against the defendant or another identified person, or B, things said or things said or done that constituted circumstances of an extremely grave character and have caused a justifiably sense of being wronged. So this point explains the aspect of fear of serious violence, which can be a trigger, or things said or done which are of an extremely grave character and they cause the defendant to have a such justifiable sense of being wronged. Then you go on to explain the cases in general knowledge. In Abrams v. Gregory, the Court of Appeal upheld the conviction as there was no evidence of provocation after the 7th and interval time, and their planned action negated the loss of control. You can write 7th of October and the interval time, etc., etc. In Richards, the provoked defense may know what he is doing but unable to restrain himself. Initially, if the scenario is relevant, you can apply Richards directly to the scenarios to state the defendant's name with the ratio. Then you go on to say what happened in the scenario. In the scenario, things said or done, you can notice that it's highlighted in purple and underlined. This is where you'd use the application. So you'd say that when Bob shouted abuse at John or something like that and shouted loudly, this caused by the victim, obviously by whoever the victim is in the scenario, caused whoever the defendant is to lose control and does constitute circumstances of an extremely grave character. Obviously you're going to go on to say how that it constitutes the circumstances of that in further detail. It is likely that the jury would decide that the defendant's sense of being wronged was justifiable, and then you go on to explain how that would work as well. So there's a lot of application here which is necessary here in regards to the 2 points raised, and also make relevant reference to the scenario and the victims. The final requirement of the defense is the objective test. I should also mention that the qualifying trigger is the subjective test. It's an objective test. Would a person of defendant sex and age with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint in the circumstances of the defendant might have reacted in the same or similar ways to the defendant. So that just sets out what the standard of self-control is. Then you go on to explain what cases are relevant. Camplin held that the defendant's age and sex had to be considered in regards to a scenario such as this, and it was later re-emphasized in Holly, where it stated that the other characteristics of the defendant are not relevant. Then you go on to explain to the scenario. In regards to the defendant's name, obviously you'd mentioned that. It is likely that a reasonable person in the circumstances of would have reacted in a similar manner and therefore satisfy all the elements in order to raise loss of control. You'd go on to say how it would satisfy those elements and say what the actions of the defendant were, and if a person in the same circumstances would have done the same thing. So essentially, I'll go do an overview now. You'd have to say where the law is set out, what the law aims to do, so it reduces the liability to voluntary manslaughter, and the first requirement is the loss of control is sufficient, so there must have been a loss of control, and the killing must have resulted from loss of self-control, sorry. Then you go on to explain the cases. I'll mention 2 cases for the loss of control, Thornton and Alawalia, then obviously relate it back to the scenario. Then there must be a qualifying trigger, fear of serious violence or things said. Ibrahim, Gregory and Richens, I've used them. Then obviously apply to the scenario in regards to defendant and victim. Lastly, there must be the objective test, which is would a person with defendant's same section A normal degree of tolerance in the circumstances of the react in a similar way. You go on to explain Camplin and Holly, and other cases which are relevant if you want. So essentially what I've done is 2 cases for each one. This will satisfy all the marks in terms of general knowledge and as well as good reference points. If you have good application skills and you can apply it to the scenario, this should be a perfect answer for you to follow as a model. Thank you.